Speed up the inheritance. I'm putting an offer on the house next week. Those were the words I heard at my husband's funeral, and for a moment I wasn't sure if grief was playing tricks on my ears. The church in Maple Ridge was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that settles into the wooden pews and the tall stained glass windows like it has been there for 100 years. White lilies stood beside Richard's casket, their scent thick in the air, and a soft piano hymn drifted through the room. People moved gently, speaking in low voices, offering sympathetic nods and careful smiles. I stood near the back of the sanctuary, holding the folded program with Richard's name printed across the front. Richard Whitmore, 1952 to 2024. My husband of 42 years. I thought I would feel overwhelmed with tears, but instead there was only a strange stillness inside me, like a lake on a windless morning. That was when I heard Jessica's voice. My daughter-in-law wasn't whispering as quietly as she probably thought. She stood just a few feet away near the side aisle, her phone pressed to her ear, her black heels tapping lightly against the polished wood floor. "Yes," she said softly, but clearly enough that the words reached me. "Speed up the inheritance. I'm putting a down payment on the house next week." I didn't move. I didn't turn around. For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood. The word inheritance echoed in my mind in a way that felt oddly sharp against the calm atmosphere of the church. Just hours earlier, Jessica had arrived dressed in an elegant black dress, her eyes glossy with what everyone assumed were tears. She had hugged me tightly at the entrance and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry." Richard was like a father to me. People around us had nodded with sympathy. Some even whispered about what a devoted daughter-in-law she was. I had believed it too, at least for a while. But now I stood there listening as she continued speaking quietly into the phone, her voice steady, almost businesslike. "Yes, Daniel thinks the paperwork won't take long," she said. "Daniel, my son. My only child." The hymn changed to a softer melody as the pianist turned a page of sheet music. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass and painted gentle colors across the floor. Everything about the room suggested dignity and remembrance. Yet the sentence I had just heard lingered in the air like a crack in the middle of something sacred. I kept my eyes on the lilies beside Richard's casket. He had loved those flowers. Every spring he planted them along the fence behind our house, measuring the rows carefully with a tape measure as if the garden were some kind of quiet engineering project. I remembered him kneeling in the soil last April, smiling up at me and saying, "You'll see, Maggie. They'll bloom taller this year." My fingers tightened slightly around the funeral program. The paper bent under the pressure, but I didn't notice until later. Jessica ended her call and slipped the phone into her purse. When she turned around and noticed me nearby, she immediately placed a hand over her chest and lowered her head as if overcome with sorrow. A moment later she walked toward me with slow, careful steps. "Mom," she said softly, her voice suddenly fragile. "Are you holding up okay?" Her eyes searched my face, perhaps expecting tears or confusion. Instead, I simply nodded. "I'm all right," I told her. And for the first time that morning, I began to realize that the quiet inside me wasn't grief at all. It was something else entirely. Jessica kept her hand lightly on my arm as if she were guiding me through the room, but her touch felt more like a performance than comfort. People were beginning to gather near the front of the church, speaking quietly and exchanging soft condolences. A few neighbors from Maple Ridge had brought small casseroles and placed them on the long table in the reception hall behind the sanctuary. I recognized familiar faces from the grocery store, from Sunday services, from the community garden Richard used to help maintain every spring. They all looked at me with the same careful expression, the kind people wear when they do not know what words might make things worse. Jessica stayed close beside me, her posture graceful and composed. From a distance, anyone would have thought she was the picture of devotion. Every few steps, she paused to thank someone for coming, her voice gentle, her eyes shining as though she were still holding back tears. I watched the way people responded to her. They touched her shoulder. They nodded with sympathy. One woman even whispered, "You are being so strong." Jessica lowered her gaze modestly when she heard that, and I noticed how naturally the gesture came to her. It reminded me of something Richard once said during dinner late last winter. He had been staring at the evening news, but speaking as if the thought had been sitting quietly in his mind for a long time. "Margaret," he said, "sometimes the people who appear the most graceful are simply the most practiced." At the time I had smiled and asked him what on earth he meant, and he only shrugged and reached for the salt. Standing in the church now, I felt that memory returning with unusual clarity. Jessica leaned closer to me again and spoke in a soft voice meant only for my ears. "Daniel will be here in a few minutes," she said. "He had to park down the street because the lot is full." I nodded slowly. Daniel had always been punctual, but today had been different for everyone. My son walked into the sanctuary a moment later, his tie slightly crooked, his hair still damp from the light rain outside. When he saw me, he crossed the room quickly and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. "Mom," he said quietly, "I am so sorry." I rested my hand against his back and closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel smelled faintly of the same cedar cologne Richard used to wear when he was younger. For an instant the resemblance between them felt so strong that it caught in my chest like a forgotten melody. Jessica stepped beside him and placed her hand on his arm. "We are all going to get through this together," she said gently, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Several people nodded approvingly. Someone murmured that family support was the most important thing during times like this. I watched Jessica as she spoke. Her expression was calm, almost serene, and if I had not heard that phone conversation earlier, I might have believed every word. Instead, I noticed the small details. The quick glance she gave the hallway where the reception table stood. The brief way her eyes moved toward the office door near the chapel where the church kept paperwork and records. It was subtle, but it was there. A quiet sense of calculation behind the softness. I turned my gaze back toward Richard's casket. At the front of the room, the lilies stood tall beside it, their petals bright under the soft afternoon light. For 42 years Richard had been the steady center of my life, the person who noticed things before anyone else did. As I stood there watching the room fill with quiet conversations and careful sympathy, a thought slowly settled into place inside my mind. Richard had always paid attention to the smallest details, and if he had ever seen something troubling about Jessica, there was a chance he had not ignored it. The service began a few minutes later, and the church slowly settled into a quiet stillness. People found their seats, coats folded neatly beside them, programs resting in their laps. The rain outside tapped gently against the tall windows, soft and steady, like a distant clock marking the afternoon. I sat in the front pew beside Daniel, while Jessica took the seat on his other side. The pastor stepped forward to the podium and opened a small leather book, his voice calm and measured as he welcomed everyone who had come to honor Richard's life. I listened to the words, but they seemed to drift through the air without fully settling in my mind. Instead, my thoughts kept returning to the small fragments of conversation I had heard earlier. The sentence replayed itself quietly in the background of my thoughts, as persistent as the rain against the glass. Daniel reached over and gently squeezed my hand. His palm was warm and familiar, and for a moment I felt the same comfort I had known when he was a boy sitting beside me at church every Sunday morning. I remembered the years when Richard would wake early to make pancakes before we left for service, the smell of maple syrup filling the kitchen while Daniel hurried around looking for his shoes. Richard used to laugh when Daniel could not find them and would say, "A man who cannot find his shoes cannot run the world." It was a small joke, but Richard repeated it so often that it became part of the rhythm of our home. As the pastor spoke about kindness, patience, and the quiet strength Richard showed throughout his life, I noticed Jessica dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The gesture was careful and deliberate. Every few moments she glanced toward the people seated behind us, as if aware of their attention. When someone shifted in the pews, she lowered her head slightly and placed a hand over Daniel's shoulder in a way that looked deeply supportive. From a distance, it would have appeared sincere. I wondered if anyone else noticed how quickly her expression changed whenever she thought no one was watching. During the reading of a short passage, I felt a memory surface with unexpected clarity. It was a late evening in our living room about 6 months earlier. Richard had been sitting in his armchair by the lamp, reading through a stack of papers while I folded laundry on the couch. The room smelled faintly of the cedar logs he liked to burn in the fireplace during the colder months. I remember asking him why he looked so thoughtful that night. He set the papers down and looked at me with the quiet seriousness that always meant he had been thinking about something important. "Margaret," he said slowly, "have you ever noticed how quickly Jessica talks about money when Daniel is not in the room?" I laughed softly at the time because it sounded like the kind of harmless observation people make about family members. I told him he was probably imagining things, and that young couples always talked about finances when they were planning their future. Richard nodded, but did not seem fully convinced. He picked up the papers again and said nothing more, though I remember he looked at them for a long time without turning the page. Sitting in the church now, listening to the pastor describe Richard as a man who always planned carefully and rarely overlooked a detail, that memory felt different. The thought slowly formed in my mind that if Richard had truly been concerned about something, he would not have ignored it. My gaze moved toward the polished wooden casket at the front of the room, the lilies standing beside it just as tall as they had been that morning. Richard Whitmore had never been careless with the future. If he had sensed trouble approaching our family, there was a strong possibility that he had prepared for it in a way only he would understand. After the service ended, the quiet inside the church slowly dissolved into the low murmur of conversations. People stood from the pews and moved gently toward the reception hall behind the sanctuary where coffee and simple meals had been prepared. The scent of warm bread and baked casseroles drifted through the hallway, mixing with the lingering fragrance of lilies. Daniel stayed close beside me as we walked, his hand resting lightly against my back the way Richard used to guide me through crowded rooms. Jessica walked ahead of us, greeting guests, offering polite smiles and grateful words. More than once I heard someone tell her how composed she seemed for a woman going through such a difficult day. She nodded each time, lowering her eyes modestly, as if the compliment embarrassed her. I said very little. I accepted a cup of coffee from one of the church volunteers and stood near the long wooden table that looked out toward the parking lot where the rain had finally begun to slow. Cars glistened under the gray afternoon sky, their windshields dotted with small beads of water. Richard always liked quiet afternoons like this. He used to say the world looked more honest when the rain washed everything clean. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched people move through the room. A group of Richard's former colleagues stood near the window sharing stories about his years managing the hardware store downtown. One of them laughed softly while describing how Richard used to measure every display shelf with a tape measure to keep the rows perfectly straight. Daniel joined them for a moment, listening with a small, tired smile. Jessica, however, drifted toward a different corner of the room where two distant relatives were speaking in low voices. I noticed how her posture changed as she approached them. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and her expression sharpened in a way that seemed more alert than sorrowful. She spoke quietly, but the tone of the conversation carried a certain urgency. I did not need to hear every word to understand the direction of it. After a few minutes, Daniel returned to stand beside me again. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, even though he had not added anything to it. "Mom," he said gently, "Jessica thinks we should start meeting with the lawyers soon, just to organize things." I kept my gaze on the rain outside the window. The suggestion arrived sooner than I expected, yet somehow it did not surprise me at all. "Your father always believed in careful planning," I replied calmly. Daniel nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Jessica joined us a moment later, her voice warm but purposeful. "I was just telling Daniel that the legal process can take time," she said. "It might be easier if we begin the paperwork early." I studied her face quietly. The expression she wore was concerned and responsible, the kind of look people admire in someone who seems ready to handle practical matters during a difficult moment. Yet beneath that expression, there was something else moving just beneath the surface, something impatient. I set my coffee cup down on the table and folded the funeral program carefully in my hands. The paper had already begun to crease where my fingers pressed it earlier that morning. Richard's name rested on the front in simple black letters. For 42 years he had approached every decision with patience and quiet thought. He never rushed anything important. As I stood in the reception hall, watching Jessica glance briefly toward the hallway that led to the church office, a quiet realization settled deeper in my mind. If Richard had truly sensed danger to our family before he passed away, he would not have left things unfinished. Somewhere within the careful plans he always made, there was likely a piece of the future waiting to reveal itself. The reception hall gradually began to empty as the afternoon moved forward. One by one the guests offered their final condolences, collected their coats, and stepped out into the damp gray light of the parking lot. The sound of quiet conversations faded until only a few voices remained. Daniel helped one of Richard's old friends carry a tray of empty coffee cups back to the kitchen while I stayed near the window, watching the rain clouds slowly drift apart above the church steeple. Jessica moved through the room with a calm sense of purpose, gathering small details the way someone might tidy up after a formal event. She folded napkins, stacked in used paper plates, and thanked the church volunteers with practiced warmth. Anyone watching her would have seen nothing but kindness and responsibility. Yet every few minutes her attention returned to the same subject. When Daniel came back to stand beside us, she spoke again about practical matters in a voice that sounded gentle but unusually focused. "The lawyer your father worked with should probably be contacted soon," she said. "It will make everything easier if we understand what steps need to happen next." Daniel looked tired, but he nodded slowly. "Yes, that makes sense," he replied. "Dad always kept things organized." I remained quiet for a moment before answering. Outside the window, the last drops of rain slid slowly down the glass, leaving clear streaks behind them. Richard used to stand at our kitchen sink on afternoons like this, watching the same quiet patterns in the rain while he planned the next small improvement he wanted to make around the house. He believed patience solved more problems than speed ever could. "Your father never rushed important decisions," I said calmly. Jessica gave a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, "but the legal system can take months. Sometimes even longer." Daniel rubbed his forehead lightly, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "Maybe we can call Mr. Hale tomorrow," he said, "just to schedule a meeting." The name settled into the air between us. Robert Hale had been Richard's attorney for nearly 20 years, a careful man with silver hair and the kind of steady voice that made people trust him immediately. Richard once told me that Mr. Hale believed in preparing for problems before they appeared. At the time I had laughed and told him he was too practical for his own good. Now that memory felt strangely important. Jessica glanced at Daniel with a quick approving look. "That would be very responsible," she said. Her voice carried the same tone she used earlier with the guests, supportive and reassuring. Yet beneath it I sensed the same quiet urgency that had followed her all afternoon. I folded the funeral program again and slipped it gently into my purse. Richard's name rested against the soft lining, still printed in clear black letters. For 42 years I had watched the way he approached every contract, every financial decision, every promise made to our family. He believed preparation was the best protection a person could give the people they loved. As the church hall grew quieter and the volunteers began dimming the lights above the tables, I felt an unusual calm settle deeper inside me. If Richard had truly sensed that something in our family required caution, he would have addressed it the same way he addressed every other challenge in his life. He would have planned ahead, carefully and thoroughly. And if that was true, then somewhere beyond this quiet afternoon, beyond the rain and the polite conversations and the talk of paperwork, there was a piece of Richard's plan waiting to be discovered. The church hall was nearly empty by the time we stepped outside. The air smelled fresh after the rain, and the late afternoon light had begun to slip through the thinning clouds. Daniel unlocked his car and offered to drive me home, but I told him I preferred a few quiet minutes alone first. He nodded with a tired smile, the kind that comes after a long day filled with emotions a person cannot quite organize yet. Jessica stood beside him in the parking lot, her arms folded lightly against the cool air. She thanked me again for staying strong during the service and reminded Daniel about calling the lawyer the next morning. Her voice sounded gentle, but I noticed how quickly she checked the time on her phone after speaking. The small gesture lasted less than a second, yet it carried the same quiet impatience I had been noticing all afternoon. When they finally drove away, the church lot became silent except for the distant hum of traffic from the highway a mile down the road. I walked slowly toward my car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. Richard and I had parked in this same lot hundreds of times over the years. Sunday mornings, charity events, holiday concerts. Every memory seemed to linger in the quiet space between the white, painted parking lines. When I arrived home later that evening, the house greeted me with the familiar stillness of a place that had lost its center. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the doorway. Richard's coat still hung on the wooden rack near the back door, where he had left it the week before he went into the hospital. I placed my purse on the kitchen table and turned on the small lamp beside the window. The warm yellow light filled the room just enough to soften the empty corners. For a while I simply stood there listening to the quiet. Richard used to say that silence had a way of revealing things if a person gave it enough time. Eventually, I opened my purse and took out the folded funeral program. His name rested on the front, simple and steady, just as it had appeared on countless business cards and letters over the years. I ran my fingers across the paper and remembered another evening from last winter. Richard had been sitting at the same kitchen table reviewing a stack of documents while the snow fell outside. At one point he paused, looked at me, and said something that seemed ordinary at the time. "Margaret, if anything ever feels rushed after I am gone, promise me you will slow it down." I asked him why he would say such a thing, and he only smiled in that quiet way he had when he believed the answer would reveal itself later. I slipped the program back into my purse and sat down at the table. The house felt different without his voice filling the rooms, but his careful habits still surrounded me. The organized folders in his office, the neatly labeled envelopes in the desk drawer. Richard Whitmore had spent his entire life preparing for the future of the people he loved. As the kitchen clock continued its steady rhythm on the wall, I began to realize that tomorrow's phone call with Robert Hale might not simply be about paperwork. If Richard had truly prepared something before he passed away, the truth about it was probably waiting much closer than anyone else in the family expected. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm morning Richard always liked. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor through the window above the sink, turning the polished wood a soft golden color. I woke earlier than usual and made coffee the same way Richard used to every day, measuring the grounds carefully and waiting for the slow, steady drip to fill the glass pot. The house still carried the faint scent of cedar from the fireplace and the lingering memory of lilies from the day before. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup in both hands, listening to the gentle ticking of the clock above the doorway. For the first time since the funeral, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt thoughtful, as if the house itself was waiting for something to unfold. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. The name on the screen read Robert Hale. I answered calmly. His voice sounded steady and respectful, exactly the way I remembered. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I wanted to express my condolences again. Richard was a remarkable man." I thanked him and listened as he continued speaking. "Your son contacted my office earlier this morning. He mentioned scheduling a meeting about the estate." I could almost picture Jessica standing beside Daniel when he made that call. The thought did not surprise me. Mr. Hale paused for a moment before adding something that shifted the quiet balance of the conversation. "There is also something your husband specifically asked me to discuss with you before we meet with the rest of the family." I set my coffee cup down slowly on the table. The surface made a soft sound against the wood. "Richard left detailed instructions," Mr. Hale continued. "He wanted to make sure you understood certain documents before anyone else reviewed them." I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the hallway that led to Richard's office. The door remained closed, just as it had been since the day he left for the hospital. For years that room had been his private space for paperwork and careful planning. I had rarely needed to enter it because Richard always handled the complicated details himself. He believed preparation was important, Mr. Hale said gently, especially when it came to protecting his family. The words settled quietly in the kitchen. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees in the backyard, brushing against the fence where Richard's lilies would bloom again in the spring. I remembered the way he once described planning for the future. He said it was not about expecting trouble. It was about making sure the people you loved would never have to face it alone. "There is a particular clause in his will," Mr. Hale said after another brief pause. "Richard felt strongly that it should be explained to you first." I felt a calm certainty begin to form in my thoughts. All the small memories from the past year suddenly seemed connected in a way I had not understood before. Richard studying documents late at night. Richard asking careful questions about finances during family dinners. Richard reminding me not to rush anything if something ever felt wrong. I looked toward the closed office door again and imagined the neat rows of folders on his desk, each labeled in his precise handwriting. "When would you like to meet, Mrs. Whitmore?" Mr. Hale asked politely. I answered, without hesitation. "Today," I said. "I think Richard would want that." As I ended the call and sat quietly in the morning light, one thing became very clear. Whatever Richard had prepared before he passed away was not simply a matter of paperwork. It was part of a plan he had carefully built long before anyone else realized it would be needed. Robert Hale's office stood on the second floor of a quiet brick building just 3 blocks from the town square. Richard and I had visited it many times over the years, usually on calm afternoons when paperwork needed careful attention. Walking into that familiar hallway again felt strangely steady, as if part of Richard's routine had continued waiting for me there. The receptionist greeted me kindly and led me to the same conference room Richard preferred, the one with the tall window overlooking Maple Street. The trees outside were just beginning to lose their autumn leaves, and the sidewalk below carried the soft movement of people going about their ordinary day. Mr. Hale entered a moment later carrying a thin leather folder. His expression was calm but thoughtful, the same careful demeanor he had shown every time Richard discussed financial matters with him. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently as he sat across the table. I nodded and folded my hands together, feeling an unusual sense of clarity settle over the room. Mr. Hale opened the folder and arranged several documents neatly before speaking again. "Your husband was very deliberate when he updated his will earlier this year," he explained. "He insisted that one specific clause be discussed privately with you before the rest of the family reviewed anything." I watched his hands move across the pages. Richard's name appeared on the top of one document in the same precise black ink I had seen so many times before. For a moment, I imagined him sitting here months ago, calmly describing his wishes in the thoughtful way he always approached serious decisions. Richard believed that circumstances sometimes reveal the true intentions of people, Mr. Hale continued. He wanted to make sure his estate would protect you first and foremost. The words did not surprise me as much as they might have the day before. The quiet phone call at the funeral, the conversations about rushing paperwork, the subtle urgency I had seen in Jessica's eyes all seemed to form a clear line leading to this moment. Mr. Hale slid one page slightly closer to me. "This clause activates under a specific condition," he said carefully. "If any immediate beneficiary attempts to pressure the estate into accelerated distribution of assets within the first 90 days after Richard's passing, their portion is automatically redirected." I read the sentence slowly, letting the meaning settle into place. Richard's handwriting appeared in the margin beside the printed text, a small note written in the steady script I knew so well. Mr. Hale continued explaining in a calm voice. "The redirected assets are placed into a trust that remains under your sole authority." I looked up from the paper and met his eyes. "Richard wanted to be certain you would always have full control if anyone tried to rush the process." The room felt very quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a light breeze stirred the branches along Maple Street. People continued walking past the building, unaware that the careful plan Richard Whitmore had created months earlier was now unfolding exactly as he intended. I folded my hands again and sat back in the chair, feeling a calm understanding replace the uncertainty of the past day. Richard had noticed something long before I did, and in his quiet, methodical way, he had already prepared the answer. We scheduled the family meeting 2 days later in the same quiet office where Richard and I had sat so many times before. The afternoon sunlight filtered gently through the tall window, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. Daniel arrived first, looking tired but hopeful that everything would be settled quickly. Jessica walked beside him carrying a leather notebook and her phone, her expression calm and confident in the way she had practiced so well. She greeted Robert Hale politely and took a seat across from me, folding her hands as if she were preparing for a routine discussion. For a moment the room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic along Maple Street below. Robert Hale adjusted the documents in front of him and began explaining the structure of Richard's estate in a slow, careful voice. He described the accounts, the house, the investments Richard had built steadily over the years through patient work and thoughtful planning. Daniel listened attentively, nodding as each detail was explained. Jessica leaned slightly forward in her chair, her attention focused with unusual intensity whenever the subject of timelines appeared. After several minutes, she finally spoke. Her voice sounded respectful, but the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. She asked how quickly the distribution process could begin and whether certain transfers might be accelerated. Daniel glanced at her with mild surprise, but she continued speaking calmly, explaining that early organization would make the transition easier for everyone. Robert Hale listened without interrupting. When she finished, he folded his hands together and looked toward me briefly before opening the final document in the folder. "Richard anticipated that this question might arise," he said evenly. Jessica's confident posture shifted slightly as he slid the paper across the table. Daniel leaned forward to read the page, while Jessica followed the lines of text beside him. The clause was written clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Any attempt to pressure the estate into accelerated distribution within the first 90 days would redirect that beneficiary's share into a protected trust under my sole authority. The room became very quiet. Daniel looked up first, confusion crossing his face as he tried to understand why his father would have included such a specific condition. Jessica remained completely still, her eyes fixed on the document as if the words had suddenly become difficult to process. Robert Hale spoke gently but firmly. "Your father believed patience reveals character," he said. I sat calmly in my chair, feeling the quiet certainty Richard had left behind settle into the room. For years he had watched the world with a careful eye, noticing small details others overlooked. He had trusted that the truth about people often appears when they believe no one is paying attention. I looked toward Jessica and spoke in the same steady tone Richard once used when explaining something important. "Richard planned carefully," I said. "He wanted everyone to have time to grieve before any decisions were rushed." Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, absorbing the meaning of the clause and the quiet wisdom behind it. Jessica closed her notebook without saying a word. Outside the window, the branches along Maple Street moved gently in the afternoon breeze. In that quiet moment, I understood something Richard had always known. The strongest response to impatience is patience itself, and the most powerful protection is preparation made long before anyone realizes it will be needed.